Buddy, I'm speaking up, so I project into our friend the owl there. Mr. Chairman, can you give me a little wave if you can hear us? All right, we are good to go. Anything you'd like to say to start us off?
Happy to be here. Look forward, eagerly anticipate the presentation. I mean, you cannot believe how eagerly I anticipate this presentation.
That's a high bar to meet. So this is a topic we have been talking about since I came on board last fall. This was something that the topic of how taxpayers are responding, in particular to the new income tax rates, but also to the pandemic, to change in working situations, has been something we've been talking about. And so we really wanted to do two things tonight, I think. One is, or three things. One is to get someone who has been staring at data on interjurisdictional and interstate migration for a long time and has a lot of expertise on what the data can tell us and what they can't tell us. And that's Dr. Criswell Young from Cornell University, who literally wrote the book on interstate migration. And the second thing was to start to the best we can, getting a peek at the tax return data coming out of OCFO and try to start to get any initial hints we have about what's going on, again, both in response to the pandemic and in response to the change in the income tax rates. So we are going to do our best to make sense of some numbers and get some guidance. And I hope we will at least partly answer some of the questions that we all have in our minds. The other thing we have on tap for this evening is that anticipating the fact that it's not just about the migration of high-income households, but also middle and moderate income households, is Richard is going to share some thoughts about the possible policy levers more at the middle income ranges, where there's a number of different options. And that's a little bit foreshadowing what we're going to be talking about in the fall as we grapple with specific policy choices. With that, actually, why don't we go around the table real quickly and maybe just introduce ourselves to Cristobal? Is that all right? Start with you, Gregory.
I'm Gregory McCarthy, a commission member.
Isham Sayin, commission member.
Johnson, you have your there.
Helen Roth, commission member. Judy McQueen, commission member.
Becky Strauss, staff for TMC.
Henry Vin, consultant. Troublemaker.
Richard Oxer, consultant, Tech Policy Center.
Good. And I'll just say, and we have on the phone, looks like just Mayor Williams. At this point, I think Erica's joining as well in a little bit. And we'll be keeping our eyes open. The only thing I'd say is, if you all down here, so when we get into the Q&A, if you guys want to move, either project really well or slow down. The folks joining from the comfort of their homes can hear you. With that, I will turn it over to this ball.
Great, well, thank you. So apologies if there's any, this is sort of a new platform for, that's your mouse. It's a new platform for sharing slides. So there's few technical hiccups that still working out, and hopefully it'll all come together. Anyway, thank you very much for having me. It's good to be here. I always appreciate the opportunity to talk about research that I've been working on for a very long time and that I'm very passionate about. So, title of my presentation, Millionaire Migration and the Taxation of Top Incomes. All of the work I've been doing draws on big administrative data from state and federal tax returns to understand the implications of raising taxes on highest income earners. So I thought I'd start the presentation today with New Jersey which back in 2004 passed one of the first millionaire taxes. This is also where I got my start in this research. I was a grad student at Princeton at the time, and there's a lot of debate about this in the air. We had the opportunity to study it. But I also think New Jersey is a great introduction because it's a small state bordered by others with really different tax systems nearby. It's part of a broader metro area. It's a small piece of a broader metro area where there's different tax systems. And places where it seems that tax migration would be especially easy.
Let me interrupt you for a sec. Please, Rasad, nice to
Yes,
see
you
you.
may. Sorry, I'm late.
I didn't interrupt to draw attention to you, but just to say, I think we're gonna go by the no. We'll let you get all the way through your presentation and then let Kim present some DC specific data. And then we'll do some Q and A, if that's okay with everyone.
And Erica Williams just joined.
Erica.
Hi, all.
Sorry to interrupt.
So I'll just start with New Jersey, and then I'll broaden the scope out to all of the US, all states. And in each case, drawing on big administrative data, and that's mostly pre-pandemic. I have some updates up to 2021, so I'll explain it as we go. Okay, so starting with New Jersey, passing one of these first millionaire taxes. Well, this is the tax schedule. They called it it was called a millionaire's tax. It kicked in at $500,000 in annual income. So you got 2.6 percentage points in everything you earn after 500,000. This is how it affected your actual tax burden, the share of your income that you pay in taxes. So this is what taxes look like, the solid line before the millionaire tax and after. So the people below 500, up to and including, didn't pay a penny more. And then the tax burden slowly increases. These people are making $10 million a year. Almost all of their income is above the threshold, so that gets you to the percent. Okay, so this was the tax change that was implemented, and we'll be thinking about situating New Jersey in the context of the New York metro area. When you're thinking about millionaires, they mostly live in northern New Jersey, which is part of the New York metro area. And so this is this relatively small geography. The 5 boroughs, just for comparison, the 5 boroughs, that's, Manhattan, Brooklyn, Queens, Staten Bronx. The top tax rate was 10.5%. That was the highest in the metro area. New Jersey, after the tax increase, was basically 9%. Upstate New York is below 7%. Connecticut is 5%. So if you imagine you're a millionaire living in Bergen County, it's a very short move over to Fairfield County, Connecticut, where you cut your tax rate, your marginal rate almost in half. Staying in the same metro area, just changing tax systems. And even more so for Pennsylvania, which has a flat 3% tax. So short moves could put you in a really different tax system. It's really, I think, is why there was a lot of concern about, there's a lot of anxiety about what would be the consequences. Okay, so what we saw just in the immediate years following, this tax was implemented in 2004. Compared to 2003, it's a growing millionaire population, up 35% in the first 3 years of the tax. So that's separate from migration, but it's important to note that incomes were growing very strongly during this period. So even if some people were moving away, the state was really strongly growing its millionaire population. Yeah, I mean, we're really focusing on New Jersey, but New Jersey also has, the high, I think the highest, as a state, anyway, it's very high. So yeah, you could think about other taxes, but our identification here is really going to focus on what happens when people who are inside that bracket. So this is migration rate from people who make $100,000 a year all the way to people making $8 million a year. in annual income. Okay, and so this is the net out migration before the tax was implemented. So despite, despite other population dynamics, there was some net out migration of millionaires out of New Jersey, at this 500,000 bracket and above, prior to the tax. So what happened after the tax? What we're expecting to see, the concern is that there would be growing out migration. So below 500K, nobody was affected by the taxes. So essentially, New Jersey taxed some people, but not others. That break happened at 500,000. And so if there's tax migration, this is where we're expecting to see it. And what we see actually from the tax increase.
vertical axis there?
Sorry, thank you. On the vertical axis is the net migration of millionaires. So it's the number of net out migrants per thousand millionaires. So this is saying that, at 2.5 million, there's a net out migration of 20 millionaires per thousand. Okay. Yeah. And so what we actually see is more like a period effect, but no effective tax per se. This is combining 3 years after the tax, and that's this dashed line. So we do see a sort of general increase, uptick in migration, but it's not specific to anything that was happening with the tax change. So this is why we say, in technical terms, we call this a period effect, but there's no tax effect per se. We could have a longer conversation, what might the period effect have been? We don't know exactly, but it's a time when New Jersey was recovering from the 2001 recession. So there's strong income growth, and in particular, there's very strong housing market growth. And so maybe New Jersey had some of the fastest growing housing prices in the country at the time. So maybe that makes it easier for people to move away than to move in. We don't know per se, but what we can rule out is that it wasn't anything unique to the tax change. Okay, so this, so basic findings here. This paper is a lot more complex, but those are the key points, right? So growing millionaire population after the tax increase, even though there was some out migration. Our technical tax flight estimates. So the taxes, the flight due specifically to the tax increase is about 1 millionaire per 2,000 millionaires that live in the state. There's a lot of millionaires in New Jersey. For every 2,000 millionaires, one moved away for tax purposes. And we estimate that the new tax raised about $1 billion in new revenues, modest reduction in income from the state. Now, this was replicated by Governor Chris Christie's chief economist, Charles Steingel, for policy people who may know. So Chris Christie was very upset with our research. One of his main policy things as governor of New Jersey was his opposition to the millionaire's tax. He used to love to say, ladies and gentlemen, if you tax them, they will leave. And he was very annoyed with us because reporters would constantly ask him, yeah, but what about that study that said that they don't move? And so he got his chief economist to replicate our results. We welcome. For a long time, they said very bad things about us and how terrible the research was. But then when they finally published their research, they had the same results as we do. A week after that, their replication dropped. The heartbreaking thing was that Charles Steingel, his chief economist, was fired for very bad budget projections in New Jersey. But some live by the sword, die by the sword. That's the thing on housing prices. Okay, so let's think about, that's just a case study of taxing millionaires in a small state. I think the question we should have in our minds is, how should we think about top income earners? Are they mobile millionaires searching for lower tax places to live? Or are they embedded elites that are really reluctant to move away from places where they become very successful? This is a question that motivates me and my colleagues to return the focus to the US in general. So a series of studies on this published I wrote a book on this broader question, with a millionaire tax vote, how place still matters for the rich. And there's a 2022 update. So the book and the study that I've listed here, we're looking at 1999 to 2011, and that was the data window that we had. For this 2022 update, we'll have it up to the first year of the pandemic. So I'll show you the main results and then I'll tell you what's different in the latest period. Okay, so we're starting here. All high income earners in the country, originally over a 13-year window, and then updated to 2021. It's an N of about 45 million observations. That's 3.7 million people who made $1 million a year in annual income. So essentially, panel census scale data on where millionaires live and where they're. We also look at a sample of the general population to say how much are the rich different. Yeah.
45,000 entries and 2.7 million millionaires. The entire period, right? So you have a lot of turnover in that population. That's whatever the number of years that we cover.
Yeah, so this is all the tax returns filed by these households. So if you ever earned $1 million a year or more, we grabbed you and we looked at your data for every year that you filed originally over this 13-year window.
So they can be in that data some years, but not.
They're always in the data. They didn't always earn $1 million in that year. If your income drops below, we still keep you in the data set. Yeah, great. Okay, so how much are the rich different? We're going to look at the general population as well. We're looking at people where they file, the state from which they file their federal tax return. And when people change the state from which they file, that's migration for us. Okay, so this broader question of tax migration, break it down into 3 simple questions. First simple question, where do millionaires live? Do they tend to live in low tax places? This is the map of millionaire density, millionaires per 1,000 population. So the basic answer is that millionaires live in the Boswash corridor. DC always disappears in this map here, but this is the area that has by far the highest density of millionaires, led by Connecticut. Well, California and Nevada, casino wealth there, tech wealth, and basically every state has some millionaires. What we want to ask is like, how much can these differences be explained by the tax differences between states? So I just grabbed that data and put it into a graph. Y-axis is millionaire density, millionaires per 1,000. X-axis here is the state tax rate. So here's DC up in the this is from the quote. 99 to 2011. Yeah. What I'm going to tell, just to spare you the suspense, most of these things haven't changed, and there's sort of one area where there's an interesting change related to the pandemic. But these are very long-term tax differences. So these rates, some of these rates have changed a little bit, but basically what we see here is no relationship between where millionaires live and where they would pay their honest taxes. So California, high tax California, New York, they're over here, but it's very similar to Nevada, Florida, Tennessee, places that don't tax any state income taxes. And then the other thing I would say about this is, well, these tax differences, like California's had progressive taxes and relatively high state taxes since the 1930s. So has New York. You know, Florida, Texas, Tennessee have never had a state income tax system. So if you wanted to live in a low tax state, you know, folks have had generations to figure out how to make that happen. And we still don't really see any association. If there was a strong tax effect, we would, you know, what would this graph look like? Well, you know, these low tax states would have a lot of millionaires in them. There would be this downward slope, which is not what we would see. Per capita, yeah. Per 1,000 population. Yeah, that's why DC comes out on top. Like the size of the circle is the absolute number of millionaires. So, you know, DC's high per capita, but being a small place. I was just in Iceland. Apparently in Iceland, they love per capita metrics because they come out of the top on so many things. The joke was longest river in Europe in Iceland. per capita. So we're capturing both the absolute number of millionaires and the millionaires. Okay, but basic base validity, it doesn't seem like there's this, to live in a low tax state. Okay, second part of this question, of this broader tax migration question, are millionaires highly mobile? Do they move a lot? We saw where they live. How often do they move? How often do they move in relation to other folks in the income distribution is in question. So this is only the general population of tax buyers. Excuse me, sorry. Just yeah. So I just looked at them. One second. I can probably that is not 2000. Should I respond or just let it be? The police decision on data from can't bring it forward, right? I mean, there's no, they may not know it now because a consciousness that is coming, especially living through San Francisco or
We can't hear the question, so if you could repeat the question that people were asking you, that would be great. Thanks.
Tony, my point is that I just can't rely on 2011 data or 2023. Life has changed.
Well, there's no, you can't dispute the facts of we do business in Florida and Texas. Florida is the largest growing by net numbers, not just percentage. 320,000 people migrated to Florida last year, and the number one reason, was tax. So, I mean, that's today, that's current today numbers that are taxed. They can't, to your point, and the Texas, I think it's right there.
Thank you. Do you want, why don't we keep going through the presentation? I think we're gonna get to
Okay.
some points that
Yeah.
respond to your very good points. So why don't you just keep going, and then we have ample time at the end to kind of chew this over a little bit.
Yeah, I do want to emphasize that I do have data updated to 2021. And so I'll talk about what's changed. But basic facts of migration is that migration declines with income. The more money you make, the less likely you are to move across state lines. So the highest migration rates are among low income earners, people who make about $8,000, $9,000, $10,000 a year. And it declines very steadily from there. And we're getting into sort of upper middle class, about $90,000 to $100,000 a year, where we see the lowest migration. And here migration rates have dropped in half, from above 4% among low income earners to about 2% upper middle class. So there's a big drop in migration. Now, what happens when you get to the sort of mobile millionaire hypothesis? When we look at the super rich, we'll go up to 5 million in annual income. You can see there's a grain of truth to this, in the millionaire migration rates do inch up compared to the upper middle class. Check the scale of the graph, though. Just keep it. So let's look up here. The people that make $5 million a year more. Okay, so they make 50 times as much as the upper middle class. They make 100 times as much as the middle class. They make about 500 times as much as these folks. So having money does facilitate moving relative to the upper middle class, but money is not the reason why people move. And people are moving for very different reasons than that they can afford to move.
You don't even really have to. I mean, it's not 2011. I'll use myself as an example. And that is, I can do my business from Florida. I can simply choose to live there 180 days a year. Yeah. I can make that choice now. In 2011, it would have been impossible for me to run.
Let's let him finish, and then we'll have questions.
Don't mind. let me ask my question and then I'll let him finish. I'm simply making.
No, just hold your question till, let everybody follow the rules. Hold your question. You'll finish the presentation. We'll have questions.
When will we have questions? That's all I'm asking.
After I'm talking.
When will that be?
When she's done.
Good.
I would say about 20 minutes from
Fine.
now.
If we stop.
30, 20, yeah.
This graph doesn't change, this graph doesn't change in 2021. The basic dynamics of migration by income, don't change, don't change. There is migration to Florida, and I would not dispute that at all. And I'll get to a graph that you'll probably, like it more. Okay, but let's recap. So the basics are, millionaires don't especially live in low tax states. They live across the country, high tax states just as much as low tax states. They have low migration in general. Okay, of the migration that we see, how much of this is tax-induced migration? So when a person changes states, we can't say it's tax migration. We need to see a specific pattern of migration from high tax to low tax states. So that's what we're going to look at next. Because, like Texas has lots of people move out of Texas each year, rich people. They can't, by definition, be moving for tax purposes. Okay, so this is a map showing net migration by state. It's sort of a heat map. So the blue is places that see net out migration of millionaires, and the orange is places that see net in migration of millionaires. And to the Florida point, there's no way to shade this graph orange enough to really convey how much sort of Florida is the destination for millionaire migration in the US. But essentially every state in the country, I have another graph here, it's not in the slide deck. Basically every state in the country except South Carolina and Arizona see net migration of millionaires into Florida. Okay, so Florida is definitely a thing. Okay, well, but what we want to say in general, how much can this map be sort of explained by the tax differences? Okay, and so here's usually where we get into these are the tax differences, but this is usually the point where we get into really complex regression modeling. That's, great, but it's hard to explain. And while I was writing the book, I'm like, I'm not going to show anyone a regression table in this book. People are just going to stop reading. So it turns out that there's a really simple way to explain the findings of this sort of complex analysis in intuitive ways. And how you do it is you just take 3 bins. You take all millionaire migrations that happened over this time period, from that 45 million tax returns filed by top income earners that we saw, put all of those migrations into one of 3 bins. This bin is called people moving to a higher tax, rich people, millionaires, moving to a higher tax state than where they lived. So, if you lived in Tennessee, you could move to most states and you'd be paying a higher tax rate, for example. That's a third of all millionaire migrations are moving to higher tax places. So this is just of all the migrations that happened.
Between 1999 and 2000.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. This exact analysis is updated for 2021, 2020, and there's no change. Okay, so a third of all millionaires are moving to higher tax states that charge them a higher tax rate than they would have paid if they had just stayed where they live. And another 21% are just moving across states that have basically the same tax rates. So there's a lot of migration that's evidently not motivated by taxes. But this is the place where we see evidence for tax migration, and that's moving into lower tax states, which is more frequent, a larger share of migrations than the others. So if these 2 bars were equal, that would mean that there was no migration for tax purposes. Then they cancel each other out. The fact that this is higher, this is our evidence of tax-induced migration, which amounts to about 15% of all millionaire migrations on net came with a tax advantage. So that's the slice of tax-induced migration. So we go back and say, well, how much migration was there? 2.4% of millionaires moved in a given year. 15% of that is about 0.3% of millionaires is the tax migration effect. So now again, we've got this long time period. We looked at 44 million returns filed by millionaires. In that total data set, we had 165,000 millionaire migrations, cases of millionaire migrations. Of those, 20,000 were tax-related migrations. So that's enough to find lots of anecdotes of millionaires of moving for tax purposes, but it's pretty small for policy purposes. Okay, so should states tax millionaires based on this? Can states is really the question that I want to get to. We can think, this is called a Laffer curve. We can think about optimal tax rates. Again, it gets technical, and I feel like people are itching to get to Q&A. But the intuition is that at low tax rates, you raise taxes, you get more revenue. At some point, you get to this peak after which you start getting more avoidance measures, people hiding income, people moving to lower tax states, and your revenues actually go down as you raise taxes. This is a formula that describes it. My piece of it is migration. This is the tax migration estimate. So what is this? So the real question is not, is there a curve like this? Of course there is. It's like, what's at the top? What's the tax rate that maximizes revenues? Okay, so if there was no tax migration, the optimal rate would be 73%. Okay, that's combined federal and state. So add up the federal and the state rate, which I think in DC is what, maybe like 47% or something of revenue. If tax migration was really high, this is something around the rate in Florida or Texas, you would say, well, the rates can't go any higher than that. My estimate is 0.1 for migration. If you raise the tax rate by 10%, you lose 1% of the millionaire population. Raise taxes 10%, lose 1% of the millionaire population. The other 99.9% are paying the higher rates. And so this is why, you get a pretty high tax rate. If you want to think about it from a business perspective, suppose you could raise the price of the product or goods that you're selling by 10% and only lose 1% of your customers. So your Walmart, you can raise your prices 10% and only lose 1% of your customers, keep the other 99%. That's a business circumstance where you're going to be, if you want to make money, you're going to be raising prices. And the analogy, if states want to raise revenue, they can do it by raising taxes on millionaires, even if there is some out-migration, optimal rate being about 68%, combined federal and state. Okay, so, the title of the book, millionaire tax flight does sometimes occur. The myth part of it is that it's just overblown. The magnitude is small and it has little impact on the stock of millionaires in the state. And essentially, the constraint it poses on tax rates is not really where we're at. Nobody's advocating taxes go up to 68%, at least not in any serious policy conversations. The policy conversations are, should we raise it 1 or 2 percentage points? Okay, so updates 2016 to 2019, that's right up until before the pandemic. Basic migration parameters are unchanged. When we rerun these analyses, we get the same stuff. What happened in here was the Trump tax bill that raised taxes on basically rich people in blue states by clawing back the deductibility. So you used to be able to deduct your state taxes against your federal, and now you can only do that a little bit. What that meant is it effectively raises taxes on the blue state rich and kind of just gave the money to the red state rich. We're being really simple about it. So this moved the blue states closer to their optimal tax rate by a couple points, but it didn't change migration behavior. We do observe migration due to the Trump tax bill, and it's exactly what we had predicted. It's exactly to the magnitude that we had predicted, that our regression models have predicted. Now, more interesting things happen with the pandemic. We have the first part of we have the initial pandemic. So I'm wondering how much to explain here, but basically how we think about the pandemic is a shock to embeddedness. It disrupted basically everything that ties people to place. Schools shut down, workplaces went remote, you couldn't see your friends, you know, urban amenities, the things that you value about living in a city, in an expensive place, all those became zero or liabilities, you know? And so think of this as a shock to embeddedness. Why are you living in this high cost place with a lot of people around you? And certainly highly paid knowledge workers can, when remote. And so, okay, so what we have for the pandemic is people filed their W-2s. The W-2s were filed, that's your employer's thing, were filed just before the pandemic started. End of January, IRS gets the W-2s. That says where you lived in January, basically. The pandemic started in March, 6 weeks later. Okay, filing the actual 1040s, your tax returns got delayed until the end of the summer. So we've got where you lived in January and where those same people lived basically in August, September. And so we can see early wave migration due to the pandemic. I'll just show you a look at this. This is in 3 cities. This is New York City. The dashed line is these same measures before the pandemic. So we got 4 years, but this is all just before the pandemic started and the years before. The same measure, you know, into that summer pandemic. About 4% of millionaires in New York City moved to a different state. A similar proportion moved out of the city, but stayed in New York State. So some tax avoidance for that, just for the city level tax, not very much. But there was, I mean, this is unprecedented amount of migration to see in a year. If you look at the Bay Area, you see the same pattern of sort of pandemic migration, a much smaller magnitude. If you look at Houston, Texas, this is like a big city in a low tax state with basically nothing. So there was a shock to embeddedness for people in Houston too, but they didn't have any tax motivation to move, you know? And so I just showed you basically a snippet of these analyses, but it does generalize to what you see from the high tax states is something like this. What you see in the low tax states is basically no migration.
It just dawned on me that 2020, I don't think people were moving 2020 based on taxes as much as New York and San Francisco was shut down, it's been made open. But it dawns on me, if we look at 2020 migration numbers, if we put those up there, the cities with the high, the states with the high migration and the states with the lowest migration, it's either this incredible coincidence that it's tax consistent, or, and I know you're looking at millionaire, but we really study migration, and that's what we do basically for a living, is study migration. There is no question that the low tax places are with.
But they're not just getting millionaires.
Well, I mean, this is focused on millionaires, but we're focusing.
Right.
I hope we're focusing on growing our base in DC, which means.
Yeah, DC has out migration and poor people in large numbers. So does California, so does New York, so does New Jersey. You know.
I understand, but we should be thinking about migration patterns. You cannot deny the evidence.
I'm getting to talk about this.
I mean,
Sorry.
No.
If we're talking evidence, I'm gonna hold the trump card here because these are the federal tax returns of every millionaire in the country.
I
You
know.
know.
Okay, we're talking about.
Not all, if I might say, at the risk of being admonished by Mayor Williams, not all millionaires are the same.
Sure. Subgroup analysis, all kinds, even technical paper.
Someone who has $1.1 million may not be up for a move. Someone with $100 million can move and save a fortune. But to treat them as the same for purposes of the research seems to ignore that.
Okay, so remember, mountains of research that I've done on this, a book, I can't show you everything, but have done subgroup analyses for 5 millionaires, for 10 millionaires, in all these papers, all the way you go through. And you see some behavioral differences, you see very little difference in tax sensitivity at the 10 million level.
You know different millionaires than I do. You look at every cent as a way to reinvest in their company.
Sure. But again, migration is its own creature.
I don't know any.
It's a problem.
So, there's definitely, so the pandemic definitely led to, migration among high income earners in places with high taxes. So I think, we're gonna call this tax induced migration, that was caused by the pandemic. There's a question of how long this is gonna go on for. Is this permanent? Is this forever? Is work from home forever? Are people coming back to the office? If you work in the office 3 days a week, how far away from your office can you live? Can you move to Texas and still, or are we really talking about living in the suburbs? And so we should be thinking about city centers versus states. I would say that in terms of stocks of millionaires, both New York and California are killing it. New York's millionaire population is up 20% in 2022. California's is up 35%. So these are new numbers that have, New York's are already out, California's are coming out within the next couple of weeks. In terms of millionaire population, these states are doing very well, even though San Francisco as a city is doing quite poorly, and deservedly so, as someone who lived very close to the place would say. So this is early pandemic, and there is going to be a question of how long it goes on for.
Okay, so these are tax filers, so
Yes.
these are households with incomes over $1 million.
Yeah.
It could be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 people in there. We're counting households. Is that correct?
Yeah, and a lot of,
Tax units, these are tax unit data, right?
yeah, and a lot of these we split the couples and count them as separate individuals.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
So we're looking at individuals that are earning $1 million.
Yeah, we're counting the migration numbers, sorry, correction, we're counting the migration numbers as a number of millionaires. So when there's 2 in a household, we count that as 2 movers. When there's only 1 in the household, we count it, but there's almost always 2 millionaires are basically all married. 90% of them are married.
Okay.
So,
I'm gonna do a quick time check.
I've got like one more point I was gonna make, but we can leave it here too, so.
Okay. Why don't you go ahead and make your point? Let me pull up, while you're doing that, I'm gonna pull up Kim's slides.
Okay. Okay, so intuition about millionaire migration, doesn't hold a lot of water. And I think the reason is because places are sticky. People advance in their careers. People who are millionaires are the late career working rich. They make about, millionaires in our data set, in the tax returns, make about 75% of their income from labor, from wages and salaries. They're the working rich, they have office jobs. As they advance in their careers, they accumulate a lot of things that tie them to place. They're very married up. They have, a lot of them have children at home. They own a piece of a business at least, if not outright. A lot of this amounts to place-specific social capital, but ultimately migration is a young person's game. And so this is, I think, one of the most important intuition points. Migration isn't about rich people, it's about recent college graduates. And so let's just look at census data. This is, 23 million people from the census. We're gonna look at lifetime profiles of migration. So along here, just like plot in your age and see where you fit. And then this is the annual migration rate. We're gonna put it by education level. So this is folks who never graduated high school. They have low migration their entire lives. These are people who graduated high school, got some college. They have higher migration, but only when they're young. These are college grads. Young college grads have migration rates of like 12% a year. They're the most mobile people in the population. Millionaires, remember their migration rate, 2.4%. So like young college graduates have 5 times the migration rate of millionaires. Finally, we put on master's degree or higher. What you see is, high migration when people are young, migration rates converge to the same rate as everyone, the same rate as high school dropouts by the time you get to mid-40s. Okay, so migration is a young person's game. What isn't a young person's game? Is making $1 million a year. Okay, so the median age of a top earner is 49. The median age of an adult mover is 30. So the way to think about this is people are deciding where to live and where to set down their roots about 2 decades before they hit their peak earnings phase and where they're going to be hitting those top tax rates. So, rich people are really the wrong focus. Every state wants more rich people. They're not mobile. In general, as a group, they're not mobile. Who is mobile are the future high income earners. So really, we're having this conversation, we should be focusing on attracting or retaining people who are at the beginning of their career, young professionals, focusing on things that really matter to them, quality of life, urban amenities, childcare, good schools, things that make you want to raise a family in the state, launch your career and raise a family in the state. And so that's where I'll leave off. Thanks.
And
It's gonna take me a second to
Okay.
pull up Kim's slides to
So-
to show.
I'm just gonna start talking about what it is I'm doing, and part of it is to try and address the issues that you're bringing up. So yes,
Are you here as a volunteer?
we're consultants now,
You're paid for by the commission?
correct?
Okay, that was never made clear to me,
Oh, I'm sorry.
ever.
So Richard and I, it took a while for us to get our contract signed.
I apologize for not knowing that.
And so partly what we're doing is I'm gonna be talking about information based on DC tax returns. And so part of this is to try and get as most recent data as we can, and also to look at things that might be talking about what's going on in DC. And so partly, this is sort of to try and address those questions about the fact that is DC different? And are things different now than they were in the period that was studied in the book? And the answer isn't that we think everything is the same. It's trying to figure out whether these trends and whether what Cristobal had presented still seems to be similar to what we're picking up in the DC tax returns. Now, okay. So if we go to the next one, right? So I'm basically looking at DC tax returns, and then we're looking at other data to try and figure out what we can say about mobility in the district.
Need to,
Yeah.
log back into the webinar and then share my
Okay.
screen for later.
Okay. And so part of this is ideally, we want to look at sort of tax data up through 2022 tax year because of the change in tax rates. We can't do that. We actually have the data, but we're missing, like, tax year 2022 data is missing about 15% of returns because people can file their returns late. And so what I'm going to be doing is talking a lot about data through tax year 2021. So it's including income that is earned in 2021. Our goal is to get you information about what it looks like from the tax returns through 2022 later on this year when we have more of them in. Like, we were hoping we could get it all in, but the fact that we're missing 15% of the tax returns means we don't know where those people are and whether they've left or not. And so that's part of what I'm gonna be doing. Okay. So what we found, and now I'm just gonna repeat what Cristobal said. Okay, we'll just keep going. Yeah. Right, but I think it's important to note that mobility seems to be limited and that there is this revenue effect that we're gonna wanna look at later. So what are we doing here? So what I have is data from the Office of Revenue Analysis, and we're gonna do this two ways. I have information about people who filed their returns in 2019, and we're looking about whether they filed their returns in the district or or aren't in the district in 2020 and 2021 and 2022 when we can get that data. So what we're doing is we're taking the population that was here in 2019, pre-pandemic, and looking at whether they've moved or not.
Are you matching social security numbers?
We are. I am.
Are you matching the first person social security number to the first person, like what happens when there's a marriage?
And I am not totally sure
Okay.
what Betty did.
Okay.
But we're using that data, and they got pretty good matches in terms of following people over time.
It's worth checking with that.
Yes.
Just to clarify, this 2021 data or 2022 data?
We're gonna look at 2019, people who are filing, and data of people's income in 2020 and 2021. We cannot do 2022 yet because we don't have all the tax returns in yet.
My only point is that's the year that the.
I understand.
10.75.
I understand.
Okay, that's-
I am being very explicit about that because I know that's what we want to do. The reason we are doing it this way is to try and get the 2022 data as soon as we can.
She'll be back with it.
And I'll be back with more information. But what I want to do is at least go through what we're finding in those other 2 years, right? Yes, we started out, I got the 2021, I got the 2022 data in. We're missing about 15% of the returns. And so we don't know where those people are. And so we can't say anything because it looks like they've left, but we don't know. Okay, so again, this is just saying what I just said. These are the tax rates. You can't see it, but we do actually have that 10.75 in the corner there. And I am very cognizant that that is what we want to think about. And we will try and do that later. The other thing I want to think about, and something that gets back to what Cristobal was doing and what Yeshin was saying, there are going to be declines in the number of millionaires in 2022 compared to 2021, purely because of what was going on in the stock market, right? This is something that I ended up talking to a lot of people about, whether millionaires had left Maryland, millionaires had left New Jersey in the years when the stock market had crashed. So after the Great Recession. And I basically had to explain to them, yes, the number of millionaires in those states went down, but the number of millionaires in Florida and Texas also went down. And it's because when the stock market does poorly, the number of millionaires goes down. And so I am expecting that when we get the 2022 data, it's not going to be as gangbusters as the 2021 data. And what we're going to have to do is try and work through what we think is a tax effect versus a stock market effect. Okay.
But stock market crash won't make that move. It will just.
No, it won't make them move, but it will change the number of people who are in the millionaires. Like,
Your base is 2019, it's
right. Yes, that's right. I do it 2 ways. That is correct. Okay.
So that has nothing to do with stock.
Yes, the number of people who realized capital gains in 2021 was high because they were expecting Biden to increase federal tax rates. Okay, so what we're doing is we're gonna look at this 2 ways. We're gonna look at it, this linked data from 2019, and then to sort of look at a broader perspective, we're gonna look at data that DC has on its website that's based on SOI, that I go back to like 2005, to just look at what patterns look like across different income groups, which isn't linking people, it's just people over time. 2 things to point out that is a little interesting. The SOI data has fewer higher income people than what I'm calling the OTR data. And that's because as data gets updated and revised, sometimes more income comes through. So I'm keeping those data separate. And so you'll see slightly different numbers for 2019 and 2020 in my tables. It's because they're from different data sources. But we want to use the OTR data because we can get it as recent as possible. Okay, so the other thing to note is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about mobility. I'm going to talk about people if they were full year versus part year filers in 2019. So the full year 2019 people are people who file their taxes for 2019, and then we're going to look at whether they moved out of the city or were part year to see whether they moved. We're also going to look at people who were part year in 2019 and look at where they were in 2020 and 2021. And those are people who could have been moving into the city or out of the city, because out of the district, because they'll show up as part year, right? If you're moving sometime during the year, you would have to file your taxes. You know, Nick moved. So part of his taxes for the year he moved were in Maryland, and some of them are in DC and the district. And so it's sort of looking at those differences. If we go back a second, right? So the key is most taxpayers file is full-time. It's about 87 to 89%. So only 10% of people are filing as part-time or part-year. And this is my way of highlighting mobility. And again, we're going to try and do this with 2022. And we're also going to try and do this with 2016 and then see how that changed in 17, 18, 19 to see whether these mobility patterns seem like they're the same or whether they seem like they're different post-pandemic. Okay, so that's what we're going to hope to do. Part of this is a work in progress. So this is just sort of showing you who files taxes in the district. Part of this is we have about 371,000 tax returns, 321,000, 322,000 are full year, about 50,000 are part year. The number part year, so this is sort of some evidence that there's more mobility in those lower income people. So the percent full year is sort of at its smallest in that 50 to 200,000. And so that's just sort of some evidence of this churn. We go to the next slide. There was also a really good study that was done by Ginger at ORA, where basically what she did was similar to what Cristobal did, where they looked at sort of tax returns, like where people filed their 2019 and their 2020 tax returns and what the addresses were. And they looked at that and they also matched it and had ages. And they were finding very similar things. So wait, did we go to the next one? Wait, did we skip? Wait, go back. This one. This is just the OTR study. I just want to talk about it because she did a really careful job and she found that people left, about 10,000 people left the city, the district. Sorry if it's annoying that I keep calling it.
What's that really on this slide? I don't even know where it is.
Wait, this isn't the right.
Slide better.
All right. No, it's after the income tax rates and brackets. No, it's back. Wait, that one. Thank you. Right, so here what they did is, and they found that it was concentrated in 26 to 44-year-olds and people who had that $100,000 to $200,000. Okay, so that I just sort of wanted to sort of highlight that very careful study, looking at post office data and other data, found very similar results in the pandemic to what was found nationally. Okay, we can go back to the.
So Kim, would you say that's more of a hollowing out of the middle?
Yes. Which is why when Richard starts talking about possible proposals, we're focused on sort of what would you do for those folks? But that's sort of highlighting his results. Okay.
Like the young professionals.
The young professionals is what we think is going on in that like 70 to 200,000 who are your most mobile people in what we're finding in our data. But let me at least get you through what we're finding in the DC data. So if we look at full-time filers in 2019, this is showing whether they're full-year residents in 2020, part-year residents, or non-filers in 2020. And what we're finding is about 13% of people are non-filers in 2020, even though they were full-time filers in 2019. And most of that is in that bottom part of the distribution of income, right? So the 0 to 30, about a quarter of them aren't filing. They may not have had income. They may not have moved. They may just not be filing. We didn't actually have that much mobility, which is interesting to me that the part year isn't bigger. But then the other point is that the number of full year residents in 2020 who were full year residents in 2019 for your over $1 million and 500 to 1 million was 91%. So they are the least likely to have gone from full-time to part-time or not filing from 2019 to 2020. If we look at the next slide, which is part-year filers. So these are people who had moved sometime in 2019, we think, or they're people who live two different places, right? The other reason you would be a part-year filers are some of those people who live in Florida part of the time and the district part of the time. If they're earning money in the district, they should be filing in part, potentially as district returns per year. And what we're finding here is for part year residents, about 35% of them became full-time in 2020. And that was higher, you know, it's sort of the limited amount there is sort of for that middle area. And then the people who became non-filers, but we do have about 11% of people are part year both years, which might be people who are moving between two houses and filing part year over multiple years. Right, so could be living in two places and filing their taxes according to how much time they're spending in each place. Okay, if we go to the next one, so this is 2019 tax filers in 2021. And we're seeing that the residents, the full year residents is a little smaller. It's like 70% overall, but we're seeing the same pattern. So of people who earn over $1 million and were full year residents in 2019, 84% of them are still filing as full year residents in 2021.
Kim, this is where I think the household analysis really matters, because if you go back to that slide, the households of high income earners are pretty stable and they don't really change. Or you might be actually smooshing different filers in.
Right.
I think
In the 2019 data.
whatever base.
Okay.
I think the idea holds, and I think that it got worse through the pandemic because you had a lot of household formation that was delayed. So
But these are, so even though these are tax filings, you
let's
think
say,
we would,
you're
living with somebody,
I'm living with someone, but we are not married.
right?
And when we get married,
Okay,
kind of move all over the place. Another interesting question that occurs to me is, for the very low level, how often people move in and out of tax filer status if they don't have income?
and I feel like that could be a big part of it. The only thing that mitigates against it, we had a lot of people who didn't have to file taxes in 2020 and 2021, who did because that's how they got their stimulus checks. We're just gonna go through fast and then we can get to questions. So part of this is also just the share of tax revenues over time. This is not from that link data. This is just from SOI data. But part of it is just knowing that the share of revenue coming from the very top has been increasing over time in DC. So about a quarter of the income in 2020 was coming from people who earned over $1 million. But also noting that even though we're going to see that the number of tax units went down, the amount of tax revenue went up in 2019 and 2020 because people were earning more. Even though some people were out of work, the highest income people actually did pretty well in the pandemic in terms of how much they were earning, and that money ended up getting taxed by places.
Does it increase the risk to income taxes because you have larger share coming from
Yeah.
sort of less stable income?
It could make it more volatile. And we're gonna see some of that when we have the 2022 data because of the fact that there was this gangbusters of money coming in 2021, in part because the stock market was doing well and in part because people thought that Biden was gonna raise taxes. So they were actually trying to realize any gains they could before taxes went up. And so there's gonna be some activity between 2021 and 2022 where we're gonna see less of that because of that timing issue. That's very similar to things we've seen in other periods before where people are shifting some of their realizations. And then if we can just, right, that's just basically showing that the share of people at the very top in that 500,000 and 1 million is still high. And it's growing over time, even in 2018, 2019, 2020. And the fact that the numbers of returns are actually going down between 2019 and 2020. Okay, and then if we go to the next one, this is just showing that it also went down in 2021. This is the super weird thing where I was looking at. And these numbers at the bottom of the share of returns that are at the very top are higher in this data. And it has to do with the fact that if people had filed amended returns, they're here. But then if we go think that's basically, the other thing I did is I looked at other mobility data we have in the city. So it's noted that population change, we actually have seen some population come back, though it's still below the population pre-pandemic. And then other studies of using things like post office information is showing that much of the decline in population is that 25 to 34. And those were the people who were the highest share of people who actually were sort of driving the boom of mobility of the population into the city was the same 25 to 34. And they left. Some of them are coming back. In other information we have, apartment vacancy rates have declined and are actually below pre-pandemic numbers. And so we're looking at sort of, now part of this could be people are living in a less dense way. So, but we're seeing people moving back into the city, and we're seeing more people move in than moving out in terms of those movers now, but we're gonna have to figure out how this all fits going forward. And do I have another slide? Yes, and so part of it is, at least the data we have so far seems to be very consistent with what we're seeing in the national studies and the stuff that Cristobal presented and other mobility studies we've seen before. And so also that thing about Florida, that's sort of like there has always been this Florida effect. Like Joe Slemrod had this, it used to be a retiree effect, right? That there was no effect of taxes on mobility except for people moving to Florida, and it tended to be people who had retired. So to the extent that we think that there might be some of this going on, we might see some of those same patterns if we think that jobs are less tied to where we are. But when we get that 2022 data, I'm hopeful we can actually try and tease out what we're seeing and whether we're actually seeing people leave or whether the people who have left are starting to come back and where we see this. Does that make sense? I tried doing that fast, but yes.
We're ready for questions now.
Yeah, why don't we take a few minutes of questions focusing on this migration stuff, and then we're gonna reserve a little bit of time at the end for Richard to walk us through some options for middle income households.
Let me ask, is it Professor Young or?
Yep.
Principal? Yeah. First of all, I think your work's very thorough. It's impressive and it's comprehensive, but it does have a point of view. So, and that's fine, you know, because I think it's well documented. But what would be the strongest argument against your conclusion, and how would you respond to it?
Strongest argument against my conclusion.
That's basically, yeah.
Interesting question to ask. I don't have an argument. I mean, we challenged the numbers a lot, and this is where the numbers come out. You know, I guess in terms of optimal tax rates, you know, there's assumptions that get built into that, and I've only contributed a piece of the optimal tax rate calculation. There's also other behavioral responses to taxes, such as reporting less income when taxes go up, which we know from evidence that we'll do that, and that's built into the calculation, but people dispute that. You know, there is a recent study that found a larger effect of migration on, you were talking
The
about
Josh Allen?
retirees.
Oh, no.
You were talking about retirees, but this is about estate taxes. And basically when estate taxes went up, this is related to the Bush tax cuts. And without getting too much into it, a lot of states effectively increased their estate taxes. And that only applies to very wealthy people, very large estates, millions of dollars. Billionaires, they're looking at the Forbes billionaire list, and they saw a significant larger migration out of states due to the estate tax that I see in the income tax due to changes in income taxes. So, you could think about, I know capital wealth taxes are sort of some kind of discussion around here. I don't know much, but wealth taxes might be more sensitive, especially, I think, bequests. People might have some greater ability to choose their residency where they pass away, and less where they would pay estate taxes. But, in general, I mean, I would go back to, what's the risk to the analysis? If we think about it at a basic level, if any state in the country raised its millionaire tax rate or introduced a millionaire tax rate in a modest magnitude in the way that that are often being debated, I would bet everything I own, that's going to raise significant revenue. We know it does. It always does. It does every time because migration rates are very low. So much of the base still pays taxes. Even when you get some migration, you've got 99% of the base still paying that tax rate. So it's just the basic math of this is pretty undeniable. Where there's room for debate is like exactly how many people move and what would be the implication 20 years down the road. There is more room for debate about that. But the basic question, are you going to get revenue from this in large amounts? I don't think it's debatable.
So I know the focus of your study is on millionaires and then going to Jewish, but did you ever look at how much is tax-induced migration of the most mobile group that you have in study?
Yeah, like the young college graduates and how sensitive are they to taxes? So we find that in general, like the general population, we run the same models for millionaires and for the general population. General population are not sensitive to income taxes. Only folks at the top are. So that implies to me that like the young professionals aren't concerned about the tax rate as much as other aspects of where they live. So, I mean, I think that there's a good model where you tax the top, and that's largely the embedded elite who aren't going anywhere. And if you use those funds wisely to invest in the things that make it easier and more desirable to raise a family in your city or your place, your state, then that can be a way where, the well-off of one generation sort of funds the ongoing success of the place for the next generation. And I think that's in part why places like California and New York are the sort of centers of American capitalism, despite having been high-tax states for 100 years.
But they also lead last year, #1 state without migration was California.
Yeah.
With 343,000 people.
Yeah.
#2 was New York.
Yeah.
299. You can say the most.
Those are low income. Those are working class folks who can't afford
#3
to.
was Illinois.
Yeah.
#4 was New Jersey, and #5 was Massachusetts.
Yeah.
Texas.
Yeah, so if you want, the Texas model is a successful model, and it's been very good for working class folks.
You look at the number of rows by numbers, not percentages, Florida, Texas, North Carolina, South Carolina, and Tennessee. And so maybe it's a coincidence that the high tax states are where most people are moving from. They're not the most popular. Yeah, and you have to, and the lower taxes where the jobs are going to, I get to your point, but it's where the people are going to. And I just think that's important.
Yeah.
In this room, that's well represented. Because for me, at least, I think we should be talking about broadening the base in DC, and that's what's gonna wind up creating the best long-term.
I mean, I talk about this a lot, and so I agree with you. This is why, Texas is a very successful model, and they've built a lot of housing for the people, and it's been it's been the fastest growing state. And places like, when I talk about this in places like California, to policymakers in California and New York, And I tell them, well, yeah, there's out-migration in California on a lot of it, and it's working class folks who are being pushed out by high cost of living. They're like, oh, poof. That's good to know. It's like, no, it isn't. So I agree with you, you know? But these are different aspects of this state policies that are working and are not working. And housing regulation is a big failure in blue states. And Texas is an example that really shows that there's a different way to do this. And even if you don't think Texas is exactly the perfect model, they're really onto aspects of this. But that doesn't mean that Texas couldn't pass a millionaire's tax and keep having that same kind of growth, because they're just really different.
It's that you're sending, though, I'm honest.
But there are,
If you'll bear with me 1 second, I promise. It's messages that we're sending that is, that resonates with me, right? The notion that just because you can, you should.
Right.
And we have overcome the reputation as being a high tax jurisdiction, which the mayor and I worked on 20 years ago to try to reverse, so that investment in capital and risk-taking entrepreneurship and jobs would come back to the city. In the last 10 years, the population of the district today is less than it was in 2014. That's a fact, okay? And so, I'm very hesitant to start sending messages again to this region. That is more than about whether or not I will move, but whether or not I will invest, whether I will come from, I'll be a German pension fund, investing in these empty buildings right here that are increasingly vacant. That's what I'm focused on. And, I'd be very interested in seeing the Urban Institute's reported data from the first quarter of this year that shows revenue plunging in New York and California by 20%.
yeah, and part of that is,
We see it.
we have it, yes.
Share it with us.
But part of it is, what I'm saying is it's plunging in part because stock markets are down and because part of it was so high the quarter before.
And I understand.
It is still really high and we have those numbers, and on the revenues. The other point I just wanted to make, because I spent a lot of time trying to get out the message that the Texas model worked for Texas, but there have been other places that have basically decimated their states when they basically tried to adopt the Texas model in Texas. I'm thinking about Kansas, right? There are things that you don't want to do where if you're basically going to say, we're going to become Texas if we cut our taxes in this way, and they basically decimated their revenue streams, ended up getting rid of a lot of their public services, and they're still recovering from what was going on under Brownback. So there just are there are push me, pull me that we just sort of want to be careful about.
Can I jump in with a question or two?
Please.
And I would just say, Texas has some things that other places, including DC, can never have and will never have, like oil, for example. So I just, it's important to note that there are different places with different economies that are going to fare differently, regardless of migration. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay. One question I have, and this is maybe sort of similar to what Anthony Williams asked at the beginning, but I think might be helpful for folks who are watching, is to just hear from Dr. Young sort of the difference between the analysis, the research that you've done with actual tax filing data versus other studies that are out there, maybe showing similar results or different results from what you've found. And then I would just love to hear from both Kim and Dr. Young about how much you think we should actually hang our hats. I heard you talking about the postal data, and I know we're kind of looking for different ways to get at more recent trends. But how much do we hang our hats on data that aren't really set up to measure migration? For example, folks who were considered sort of long-term or fully having moved out of the district are folks, when you file like your paperwork with the post office to have your mail sent somewhere else,
basically, if you're 6 months, you're gonna be gone 6 months or longer, you're a like long-term or permanent move in their book. That's not really how we think about necessarily migration in this context. So, you know, there are lots of data sources out there that we can use, but they may not all be set up to measure migration in the way that we want to. So I just would love to hear folks talk about that.
Before you answer, let me just do a quick housekeeping. How about after you answer that question, I'll check in particularly with Sam, Carolyn. I think Glenn's on the phone, Gregory, who haven't had a chance to get a question in. So think about what you might want to weigh in, and then, I do want to make sure we give Richard a little bit of a chance to get him before we go to, we're packing a lot in as the summer moves forward. Sorry, so go ahead, Chris.
In terms of other studies, there is a growing literature on this, and it's my assessment of that literature that it's very common to see small migration effects. And there's some studies that find big effects among very small subsets of the population. So there's a couple of studies that have looked internationally, and they find that among the native-born population, there's virtually no tax migration. It's international, so it's a different context. But if you look at non-native, these are elites we're looking at, top income earners, the non-native borns are highly mobile to tax changes. The problem is that, that's interesting, but the non-native borns are like a tiny fraction of the millionaire set in any given country. So, the policy implications are driven by the domestic, the native born millionaires, which is very little. There is a study, there's another working paper out. I didn't present on California, my work on California. That's been replicated by one of my former colleagues at Stanford on California millionaire migration. And so in our original study, we studied 3 taxes. In the 90s, tax cut on top earners. We found no effect on migration. In early 2000s, California's first millionaire tax, 1 point, we found no effect. And then in 2012, a larger millionaire tax, and we found a small effect of that. Stemmer guy went back and he had the same data as us. He replicated the 2012 and found a bit larger effects. Basically followed our methodology with some tweaks. It's a good paper. He found a bit larger effect. It's fine. He didn't replicate the other two tax changes. So I interpreted that meaning that he agrees with us and didn't have anything to add. So, the differences here are very small. So the New Jersey study, which I presented, as I said, was replicated by Chris Christie's chief economist, who found basically the same, who had very cranky things to say about us, but ultimately found the same results. So that's sort of my assessment of the literature.
Erica, did that get at what you were asking?
And then I was just gonna say that I think partly looking at the data and seeing sort of whether people are moving, like the post office data in and out, I wouldn't only rely on that, but I think it's sort of interesting to sort of look at some of those data sets as you're looking at other information. So part of it is sort of recognizing that we're not sure how things are changing, like that New York City change that you had.
Yeah.
There's a part of me that almost thinks that's sort of the apex, because I feel like when schools started opening, a lot of the people who were in New York City actually returned because they needed their kids to be back at school. And so I think part of it is trying to interpret the data that we have, but understanding what its limitations are becomes really important. And then recognizing that we just sort of want to think about who is leaving and who is not. And not only what messages we're sending, but also whether we're raising the money we need to raise. And so I think they're just sort of trade-offs you want to think about as you're
We
figuring
can't
out.
answer that question because we didn't analyze it.
Yes, we're going to try later.
And we decided not to look at expenditures. I'm just making my point.
I guess I'm really curious about, like, I understand the supposition that there is
that migration patterns are static with millionaire population, improve that and tax that. I think where I feel like I may have a blind spot is the compounding effect of public safety, neighboring jurisdictions with much better benefits. Millionaires who feel like they're getting taxed without the value of benefits from living in a jurisdiction. And we want to attract a populace that is up and coming, who have maybe the same sensitivity to these compounding effects that will stymie their decision to enter a jurisdiction. That's the part that I'm curious. We don't talk about the migration reasons because of people are afraid to walk on the street or afraid to take their kids to a park or schools and so I hear these separate conversations about, in reality, these are all compounding things. People make decisions based on different things. So it's not a monolithic kind of assessment from where I sit. 60-40. Yeah, it's just somebody, but I just.
But are these not the kinds of variables that should be superimposed in your study, that you look at DC more closely?
Well, and so part of it that becomes hard is, they actually had me come talk when, like, Christie was attacking the New Jersey stuff. And partly, I have a reason for why I think millionaires leave New Jersey and like those upwardly mobile people are moving into New Jersey. And it has everything to do with schools and nothing necessarily to do with taxes if we're thinking, right? So I think it's right. I feel like part of what we're seeing in when people are leaving, and especially if we have those moderate to high income people leaving the city, I think it has to do with schools and affordability, depending on sort of what the push me pull me is. And I think that's right. And we need to sort of figure out whether that's beyond the scope of what we're doing or not. But I feel like I should let Richard talk because I feel like that's one of the points. Or are we waiting on Richard's stuff?
Let's did that answer your?
In some ways, I mean, what's really funny about today's conversation is I literally just had coffee with a buddy of mine who is the CEO of Bloomberg in Washington, and he knew I was coming here, and he said, "That marginal tax rate, man, make sure you bring it up." So you have a group of, and not just because he's a high earner, but because he's a high earner that says, well, wow, I'm bordered by jurisdictions that I can easily tax. I'm not getting the benefits of what I feel is the safety of my children in this current kind of uptick of violence. And so when I drove over here, I thought, and now just confirmed, like there are these compounding effects that we need to address, or not address, but we need to consider. Sorry, wrong word. And how does that play out in all of this? And if we're going to make it equitable, how does broaden that base equal equitability in this process? So it's just all these.
Do you want to say anything quickly about?
I mean, I just completely agree. I mean, it's the thing about public goods and services that the rich consume, we tend to think that the poor do that, but the rich do too. And, just in the broadest sense of living in a vibrant, successful city that feels good and walking on the streets, feeling good. Rich people are willing to invest a lot in having a nice house. And I think like that extends beyond the edge of the driveway. If you can get a government that works, efficient use of revenue, productive use of public goods and services, it's improving quality of life. I actually think that millionaire taxes are not that controversial, as long as they're at a reasonable level. But, apparently that's like the side of the equation that the commission decided not to talk about. But I completely agree with what you're saying.
Gregory, run out.
Yeah, sure. I had to say, I was really looking forward to this presentation tonight, and I came away extremely disappointed because nobody's going to change their mind based on anything we heard today. I agree with everything that's been said by everybody. And there are so many factors in the data, the COVID, the stock market, everything else that is a question mark about whether the data really is going to be useful in making long-term projections. And I think some of the points that David and Jody made are absolutely right. And I wish more of the data was about net impact to taxes, because our purview is not the population of the city, it's net revenue. So the person making $30 million who left, who appears like this on your chart, versus the 150 people who make $20,000, God bless them, we want them to stay true. But in terms of an impact on what we're caring about, I never really got a differentiation. And what it says to me is everybody left because of affordability. The rich people, their perceptions that they can't afford taxes, and lower income people because they can't afford housing. So we are an expensive place to live, whether you're rich or poor. And that's what's driving the out-migration. And I think at the end of the day, I don't know how we're going to take all this information we've heard today and actually know with any unanimity among us what is the net impact. Because I think the data is just not knowable right now. There are too many factors that we just don't know yet. And, you know, and the other thing is, sure, a lot of people, to your point, the stock market went up. They were just sitting there and they didn't move. But the next year they weren't millionaires either. And it's just it's not clear. Nothing is clear based on the data we had today.
But we can say if they were millionaires in 2019.
Right.
So Yesham's remark was right. It doesn't matter what their income is in 2022. It's going to be whether the people who were millionaires in
And it
2019.
depends on the national economy too. Like if people are confident about where the economy is going and the district. The other thing I think you guys should have looked at more is that the New Jersey to Connecticut example is not the same as moving from Georgetown to Roslyn. And your kids can go to the same private school. You can go to the same movie theater, the same favorite restaurants. It's not an hour and a half long commute. And so that a better thing is Chevy Chase, DC to Chevy Chase, Maryland. That's what we really should be measuring. The Florida thing is going to happen for all the reasons you said all along. It's the Georgetown to Roslyn and the Chevy Chase to Chevy Chase thing that I really didn't get a sense of tonight. Okay, end of rant.
Can I just say, because Gregory, everything you just said, I think kind of underscores the point of what I took away from the conversation tonight, which is that a lot of things matter, and taxes, like the magnitude of it and its impact on migration is pretty small. And that, so other things should be shaping the decisions we make, like how do we make sure we're not losing folks because they can't afford to live here or because they don't want to settle down here because it's too expensive. Like we should be considering other factors in like the tax policy decisions we make rather than hyper focusing on people with a lot of money fleeing, because that's not really what's happening. There's a lot of stuff happening when people move, and that not that many people are moving. Anyway, I think my takeaway was sort of precisely the same, but my interpretation of it is different than you. Like, I think what we heard tonight is that we have a lot of things to focus on, and like the idea of millionaires picking up and running out of the district is probably shouldn't be at like the top of the list of things we're factoring in.
I do. I mean, I really appreciate the comment from Gregory and Erica. Here's where my mind is. Sort of, we talked about this a little bit before this meeting, Cristobal, like, what are the conditions under which any of this is true? Like, what are we missing? And I think perhaps going back to Tony's question, what is the strongest argument against what you are presenting is, what are some other factors that shape that period between 1999 to 2020 that are unlike what we have experienced after that? And then I really appreciate the efforts to try to like tease that out in the outer years. But we had the Great Recession, but outside of that, like no major, still a period where the cities populations have been growing, so on and so forth. And I mentioned this because I think Erica sort of, I I agree with you that the evidence has shown so far that taxes is not one of the top reasons why people move. But here's what I worry about. I think, but to what extent? And I think another area in your paper that was interesting to me, but maybe it's hard to get our arms around it, is when we are working as a tax revision commission and when we make recommendations in December, it will be at the beginning of a period where the fiscal conditions in the city will be worse, or at least the available money will not be there. So we can debate about whether this is a revenue neutral package or whatever. When we send out to the mayor and the council, the immediate goal will be to raise revenue, to cover for whatever it will be missing in the 2025 budget. So I don't think we should just say, oh, people don't react to tax increases, so let's pile up the income taxes, because what we don't know is to what extent people will bear it. And I think there's a big difference between saying taxes, move decisions are driven by many factors, but it's another thing to say, therefore we can jack up the income taxes by 4 percentage points. I think that's like the more important part, at least to me. And maybe we can invest some resources in learning more about that. Thank you for.
Yeah, I mean, I think the challenge, the challenge is that this commission set a specific goal of learning from the data and the research, and data and research by their nature are backward looking. And we don't have data on the future. And so, we're doing our best to, right? We're doing our best to extrapolate lessons from the past. I think part of what you're saying, Yeshim, is about caution and about risk. And, we know from the research that's been presented here today that taxes do matter. Taxes do affect migration decisions. They affect them, particularly for higher income people. It's a question of magnitude and where they fit into these broader, complicated policy discussions. So this is absolutely just one piece of the puzzle. I'm very open to additional ideas for research we can do over the next few months. We do have these guys on contract now for a big chunk of their time. We have other experts we can draw in, so very, very happy to consider other chunks of research on this. Questions. Let me get a sense of the room. Richard has a few slides, now on just teeing up some questions about middle income households. And the reason I thought this was fit is that we do see some data about middle income households departing the district. And it's a theme I've heard, the mayor's folks raised it back in February. What can we do in the tax code to make this a great place to live for middle income households? And so it's not a lot of revenue. We're not losing a lot of revenue, as Gregory points out, when middle income households leave. But it has been raised as a concern. So this is we're now switching from a database presentation to a much more discussion about policies. And so I just want to get a read of the room. Are you all wiped out, or do you want to use balance or not on this?
This would be interesting. Define the income so we know.
Perfect segue.
Yeah, perfect segue. Hell no. Now that we're all in agreement on rich folks, let's mix it up on middle income. And I'll jump right to your question. What is middle income in the District of Columbia? That is a question that will keep us here all night, because different people have different answers to that question. By the way, if you can't tell, I'm going to fly through this presentation so you can actually talk about it when I'm done. Okay, median income in DC, $97,000. Yes, sir. Okay, $97,000. That's median. Okay, what's median in Ward 3? $134,000. What's median income in Ward 8? $39,000. This kind of gets to Gregory's point. Different people have different questions about affordability. It's all valid. What I'm trying to get out of this presentation, it's about your values and your priorities. I wish I could give you data that says do this, but I cannot. I can only show you options about how you can affect these groups. But I'm going to walk you through the pros and the cons so that hopefully in later conversations, you can have these conversations and decide what you want to do. I also do want to quickly, though, just refer to Rashawn's point, because he made it better than I can. I work in the Tax Policy Center. This is the Tax Revision Commission. I'm going to give you a bunch of tax stuff. That doesn't mean this is the best stuff to do for middle income families. This is just the options that I can give you that you can make. It may in fact be programs. Those programs might take tax revenue. But I'm going to try and show you some different approaches to tax cuts that can get us thinking about what we can do with middle income families. And so the next slide, because this is a bit difficult. If you want to help rich people, just cut the income tax rate. Leave, done. Okay, for middle income folks, you're gonna have to try and do some different things. There's gonna be some different pros and cons with what you're doing. So Nick, let's just get into it. So jump to the first idea. For qualifier, these are not my proposals. These are not the best proposals. These are illustrative proposals to help to get you thinking about what different stuff can do. And one of the simplest things you can do is cut income tax rates. These are the current income tax brackets in the District of Columbia. Now keep in mind, this is taxable income. So that's after your deductions and expenses. And so when you look at this, if you see someone who's earning $60,000, well, that family's probably earning closer to $80,000 because they're, you're taking some stuff off. But to give you a general idea how this goes, and then also just quickly, we have one bracket, but we have that ridiculous married filing separately on the same return thing to prevent the marriage penalty. That's a bunch of nonsense I don't want to get into. So let's go to the next one. A very simple, easy to understand thing you can do for middle income households is reduce tax rates. That's why politicians across the country love this option. Why lots of states pass tax rate reductions. And there's a few ways you can do this. One, just drop a rate. So on the left, we have that 10,000 to 40,000 taxable income. It's currently 6%, just drop it to 5%. It's a middle income tax cut. Alternatively, you can do something where you create a new bracket. You can see DC has a lot of chunks of income in their brackets. So you can create a whole new one between 60,000 and 100,000 and make it 7.5%. Yeah, it's a big tax cut for right in that group. People earning probably, again, a little higher above that because it's taxable income. Less tax cut.
Can you give us a sense of the percentage of each one of the groups? Maybe not tonight, but.
Not tonight. I could go back and see the numbers, but yeah. I think Kim had something that kind of showed that, like, I think if you go through her slides, you had some breakdowns. And so if you want to pull up hers, she has something. But generally you're gonna get like, little at the bottom, then a big in the middle, and then, smaller toward the top.
So can I interrupt? I have the tax numbers. So we're trusting that you got these right. It goes from the last capper. So $100,000 a year or more make up 27% of the filers, pay 85% of the treasury income tax. So 27% pay 85% more.
Is that 100,000?
If $100,000 or more are 27.34% of the filers, and they pay 84.36%. Right, so between 75 and 100,000 are 9.8% of the filers. They pay 6.3% of the revenue.
Is that taxable?
These are income taxes. The rich people got all the money and the lower income people have benefits that prevent them from paying taxes.
And so just to put a fine point on it, the bottom under $50,000 is about 48% of the population, and they pay 3.7% of the income tax. So once you get under 50,000, there's not a lot you can give back because there's not a lot that's been done. So
In adjusted gross income, not in taxable income, because again, these people, because of standard deductions, you got $10 in taxable income, your household most likely made, like, you're married, $25,000. So if you're single, to have $10 in taxable income, you gotta make 12,000 or something, because that, or the EITC is gonna take it all off. But yes, there's a bunch of stuff built in which prevents your taxable income from happening.
Do people with income, if you cut that $10,000 to $40,000 percentage down to 5%, is it only people in that bracket who benefit?
No.
Hell no. Next slide. Because these are marginal income tax rates. The way it works is when you go through that bracket, your first 10 is taxed at that, the next 30 is taxed at that, and dot, 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 dot. That works the same whether you have 10,000 or 1 million in $10,000. You're still going through the same journey through those tax rates. That gets to the cons. Just to clarify the pros, this is really simple. It's easy to understand. It works. It gives a tax cut to everyone who has that amount of money. In 2013, we created or recommended the creation of that 6.5% bracket because that commission said there was a disproportionate burden on middle income households, and this was a simple way to relieve that burden. But to Nick's point, there are downsides. One is a huge revenue cost. No matter how you do this, it's going to cost a lot of money to do it. And then two, if you're rich, you get all of it. those are not targeted. Those are at a band of income. But for example, if we think about that new possible hypothetical 7.5% rate, a household with $70,000 in taxable income, well, they only have $10,000 in that band, 60,000 to 10,000. So they only get a $100 tax cut. You earn above 100,000 up to, 100 million, you still get that tax cut because you have income in that entire band. And so therefore you get the full $400 tax cut. So income tax rate cuts, simple, easy, deliver for everyone, but don't have a very targeted benefit. Speaking of targets, let's talk about child tax credit. And rule of thumb is that if you want to do simple, broad rates, if you want to deliver it to a specific group, do a credit. And CTC is an increasingly popular way for states to deliver benefits to families. I think we're up to 14 states that have a child tax credit. Works just the same like the federal one. If your kid's eligible, you get a credit that reduces your income tax or gives you a benefit if it's refundable. Another thing about this, it's homework, but it's good. You get to design this. You get to say, how much money per kid do we want? Is it refundable? I'm guessing it would be. What age children do we want? And you put income restrictions. Unlike that rate cut, you can say, no, if you earn above X, you will not be benefiting from this. But pros and cons, it's a double-edged sword. Pros, you can really target this. If you think the most important thing you can do right now is families, here's a way to help people with children. And you can really turn the knobs on this. So for example, a lot of states give really big benefits by capping it at age 6. Because the fewer people you're giving it to, imagine you have a pot of money, the bigger benefits you can do that. I quickly went past Vermont. Vermont gives, if you have a kid younger than 6, a $1,000 credit. The reason they can do that is because they're concentrating this on families with young children. So again, getting to think of what is our motivation? Who are we trying to help? Thinking about ways to do this. The flip side of that, though, is that you are targeting. Something like only 1 in 4, 1 in 3 households in DC have children. So a large swath of the population who would be in our considered middle income group will not be seeing any tax relief. Okay, we'll move quickly. I want to just talk property tax for a few seconds. DC has a flat property tax rate. There's no reason that its property tax rate could not be similar to the income tax rate where you would have multiple brackets. You would do this because you could do something where you could lower the rate on the lower part of the home. Now, again, I would suggest be marginal. Now you want to create cliffs, but that lower rate is so that would concentrate the benefit. However, again, note, this is just, I made this up. It's a hypothetical. It would require a lot of work here. This would cost a lot of money. Anytime you pay with property taxes, it costs a lot of money because we have so much value in our property. So you would need to try and think of a way to honestly raise it, probably on higher value homes. So do under the pros and cons. Again, trying to find a new way to do this rate and lower the burden on lower, valued homes. That would be really simple to deliver property tax cuts to everyone who owns a residential piece of property. But you'd really have to do the math on this. And you really have to take revenue into consideration. And then once you do that, now you got to be careful because you don't want to turn the knob so much that, well, we just did this and actually highest value homeowners get the biggest benefit. Or you do it some other way and wait a minute, we've actually raised taxes on a huge chunk of middle income families. And so again, while rate cuts are simple, to balance that out, it could get possibly tricky. But kind of similar to the income tax, there are other things you can do. And one thing you can also take a look at is the deed and recordation tax. This is what you pay when property is transferred or sold. There's a 1.1% tax on the first $400,000, 1.5% on greater. You got to pay it twice because the buyer and the seller, so you actually double that. Blah blah blah. The point is, DC offers a special low tax to first-time home buyers of 0.75%. So if you qualify as a first-time home buyer, you pay less in tax. You have to purchase a home its value is less than $684,000, and your household income cannot exceed $179,000 to $338,000, depending on the number of persons in your home. So there's a lot of things you could do here. You could reduce that rate even lower, make that rate 0. You could say, buy a first-time home, you don't pay that tax. You can make the home value more expansive to incorporate higher value homes. You can increase the income. Again, you can turn all those little knobs to try and target this benefit. But negative. Positive, you could possibly incentivize a bunch of people. We talked about people who leave here to buy a home here, to put roots here, to become one of those embedded people here. If you do that, you might incentivize those people to go from Roslyn to Georgetown, or from Chevy Chase to Chevy Chase, or on the other side of the way. And once you live in DC, pay income tax. You pay all those other taxes once you've kind of gotten in the door. Again, though, huge revenue costs. There's a revenue cost to all of this stuff. That's the biggest, downside to all of it. You have to find a way to balance that out. And then also, while you can kind of set caps and whatnot, you still are ultimately giving benefits to the people with the highest value homes when you go this route. Final slide. Again, the very point of this rush presentation was simply that there are different things you can do, but they all involve trade-offs. Some other possibilities that Nick and the rest, and Mike and the rest of the staff is going to walk through in the fall. You talk about proposals, things like exemptions for retirement income or for childcare expenses. Changing DC's property tax circuit breaker, or increasing the homestead deduction. The basic trade-off you're going to get in all these things is that the broader and simpler it is, the more odds are that it's also going to go to people who you might not be targeting. But the more narrow and targeted you get, while that will keep your revenues capped and will deliver a big benefit, you're going to be leaving a lot of people out. And so what hopefully this commission will do through its policy discussions is think through, we have limited resources, how do we want to use them? Who do we want to prioritize, and how do we want to design tax changes around benefiting them?
Great. Let me ask just a question on additional opportunities to use the tax code as a way to incentivize behavior we want. Because often we have these discussions that we want, as opposed to what the conversation very frequently is. It's about how do we take money from this pot of people and give it to this pot of people, without having the tax policy incentivize the behavior that we want to encourage. So if we want to encourage homeownership, eliminating first-time home buyers or for certain income levels, the deed and recordation tax, frankly, it's not going to cost the Treasury that much, but it's a great way to get people in homeownership, that 30-year fixed rent. See what I mean? You can also, because we're not talking about a lot of money, you could either have a tax abatement on that real property for new home buyers for 5 years, or you could have a freeze so that people know that their costs are going to be frozen for a period of time. These are just examples that if we're curious about wealth creation, homeownership is still a proven path, have establishing roots, creating incentives that tell people if you do this, the city is going to do that, and you're going to have a chance, right? You and I have spoken about the opportunity accounts and incentivizing people to save by matching city funds with what they save, provided they do things that we want them to do. I don't mean to sound paternalistic, but there are some things we want people to do. We want people to save for education. We want them to save for a home. We want them to save for a medical emergency. We want them to save for retirement. If you do those things, we will give you a 5-to-1 match on what you save, provided you use it for these purposes. Now, is that tax? I don't know. You could make those accounts tax-free, do any number of things. But I'm more interested in how we use the tax code to incentivize people to do things than I am to redistribute money from one group to another, because that is a culture of envy, in my opinion. You never build great civilizations based on envy. This city spends twice as much as the national average combined on services, and yet we have some of the worst outcomes imaginable. We have 3 times the indebtedness of the folks in Maryland. Everyone at this table owes $28,000 in capital debt. And if no one is paying because we pushed all the bills to this echelon here, then everything is free. And what happens? We get so indebted that twice as much on debt service, correct me if I'm wrong, between $800 and $1 billion a year on debt service, I'm almost done, versus $500 million on police. My point is, I'm asking, Gregory, if we could have, I've been asking this before, can we have policy recommendations that incentivize behaviors that create wealth and opportunity? That's the question.
Nick and Mike will be teeing up a long set of policy opportunities that you can possibly endorse on this commission. However, I will warn you that you could not endorse all of them. They come with costs. And so you're gonna have to prioritize the ones you want to do, and also just in general, where you target, where you without.
Did you look at the, eliminating the cap, the annual rate of increase cap on property taxes?
We did, we are looking at, follow up, Nick, if that's something you're specifically interested in. I tried to bring up things that we have not discussed in the past. So for example, we discussed the circuit breaker that benefits low-income residents.
That's something I would think is weighted heavily towards high-income homes.
Absolutely.
So you were gonna raise some money through, and that's an asset that they're gonna sell eventually and make a lot of money off of
Yeah.
anyway. So I wonder how much that would earn us, the city, if we
So
did
this
that.
was, I think it was in one of the presentations, we had the person from Lincoln who said,
Adam did it, I think.
yeah, that basically, your point is that if you put a high power cap on how much the value can increase, basically, the longer you've owned it and the more valuable the home is, you get this huge tax cut. And you could possibly change that, ease that up a bit, so they're paying a little bit more and using those revenues for targeted things. For example, you basically be trading, yes, you're gonna pay a little bit more on your home, now that you've owned it for 20 years, but it's gonna help someone new buy a home in the district. And that's the type of trade you can possibly
It
make.
also had a very perverse effect during the Great Recession because housing values went down, people were sort of like losing their jobs, but their tax assessments were
Right.
still going up to catch up with what was in the past.
The 10% assessment cap,
It's
is
okay.
more, has a smoothing effect, basically. So it does cut people's taxes during times of sharp increases, but it sort of evens out over time. The one that we will be looking at is the 2% assessment cap, that just went into effect, specifically for seniors. That's gonna cost a lot of revenue.
We've had a great discussion. Let's start wrapping it up.
Yeah, so just to respond to David, please get me up. Can you give us a paper on this opportunity?
It's a district law. You guys do work on the opportunity counts?
For low-income people.
I'm happy to.
There's a district law, they're called opportunity counts.
Yeah, we could solve stuff.
It's already-
I don't have any paper. I wrote this bill a million years ago. The mayor keeps putting more money into it, but we just don't have enough money in it. But it incentivizes the very behavior that at least I care about.
So you want to just, maybe we're gonna talk offline about what the specific, what your specific, that's gonna be good. Anything else?
Thanks very much for the presentations. Very helpful.
But the presentation was very good. I mean, we all have disagreements on this and that, but thank you for your thorough work. Both you and Kim, thank you.
Thanks so much. And 2 weeks from today, we're gonna be talking more about property taxes. That'll be our last meeting of the summer, starting in September. Every Tuesday night, starting September 12th, talking about concrete options, including those you have seen discussed here and something to look forward to. Starting September 12th. I'll send it to that. Yeah, I'll send a note about that.
And the city wasn't very.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you all. Have a good night.